Hello, my name is Linda McZill. My PowerPoint presentation is about debates over whether a Confederate statue monument from a government park is to be relocated from the center of a small southern city of Brunswick, Georgia. The year was 2020. A graphic display went viral of the death of George Floyd on the Officer Derek Chauvin's knee. The nation and globally the world was almost immediately engulfed in protests from huge cities like New York and remote tiny towns. The scenes captured on video by a teenager showed something akin to a snuff film as the world watched a man die in front of our very eyes. Very close to the George Floyd killing, our small town of Brunswick experienced its own killing, caught on video, also going viral. Brunswick joined the protest, not only for George Floyd, but for our own issue of the killing of Ahmad Arbery. Shot and left to die in broad daylight on a street while jogging by those who claim they were trying to make a citizen's arrest. The people who killed Ahmad Arbery, like the people who killed George Floyd, were not arrested until the video came out, and then only after protests and the FBI was brought in. This prelude or explanation is necessary to proceed why the debates are sparking over the removal of this monument. Because our protest in Brunswick saw this Confederate statue sitting in our midst on federal land as an affront to what they perceived as blacks being targeted by police brutality and white supremacy and racism. Although this statue has stood there since 1902, it had to go. I reside here in Brunswick, Georgia, and this is a hotly debated issue, local issue, as the men who killed Ahmaud Arbery were finally arrested and held without bond for over a year now, and the trial is to get underway in October of this year. Also, one of the men had recently retired from the district attorney's office, one of the men that shot Ahmad. He recently retired from the district attorney's office as an investigator, and also he had been a former police officer. The district attorney at the time herself was voted out of office in 2020 for her part in refusing to charge this case. A special prosecutor had to be brought in to oversee the charging of the case. I chose this local issue to present my PowerPoint on because the similarities are so close to George Floyd. Ahmaud Arbery was not dead after he was shot, but he was not given CPR or any life-saving measures, even after police arrived. Ahmad, as seen on video, lies there breathing his last as he was talked about, one of the men using racial slurs. It was only after minutes passed that only one police officer saw fit to do a type of CPR which was too late because Ahmad had bled out by then. I also chose this issue because this issue feeding off of the national issue of George Floyd and police brutality toward blacks. Our local issue became magnified, and protests and unrest was threatening our city of Brunswick as it had the city of Minneapolis. Although I personally do not feel Brunswick is a racist place to live, the conversion of George Floyd, Ahmad Arbery, and the COVID-19 pandemic together placed the Confederate statue in the crosshairs as an outlet. BLM, or Black Lives Matter, Confederate graffiti was sprayed on the monument, and the topic has sparked a lot of debate here that was fueled also by Confederate monuments being defaced and taken down around the country. Brunswick looked around and saw this icon, a Confederate statue, which did not even have a name, which probably few people had noticed or care about before this past year. I know I didn't know it was a Confederate monument, and I've been past that park lots of time. Also, I didn't know that the land was government land. It's just a beautiful park in the middle of town. All of a sudden, this statue represented every evil in racism and white supremacy, and the debate was on that it had to go. This may be a local issue, but seeing as what happened in Minneapolis and other cities, Brunswick officials would like to be proactive in not having riots and destruction of property. Although they do welcome peaceful protesters, which we have had some peaceful protesters. We have not had the looting and rioting that we've seen in some of the other cities. The city knows that in October of this year, when these three men go on trial, that Court TV and other well-known media will be here in Brunswick, Georgia, and outside protesters may come in. If the statue's removal can be facilitated before then, maybe it will not be a lightning rod later this year. The relevance of the issue of removal of this Confederate statue is that this statue was more than an icon on government land. After all, the statue had been there for over 100 years, had been there since 1902, without anybody here in Brunswick that I know of protesting against it. But at this time, 2020, 2021, the statue represented what was happening in the country, in the nation, with the George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter. But it also had a more close to home reason. The murder and cover-up of Ahmad Arbery here in Brunswick, Georgia, happened around the same time that George Floyd was murdered. Ahmad was murdered in 2020, I think either the month before or after George Floyd was murdered. The time frame of these two killings of black men by white men, one by a police officer and the other by a former police officer who used the law of saying he was doing a citizen arrest, international attention of George Floyd's murder, and protests around the nation and the world drew attention to all things that seemed racist here in Brunswick. So this statue became a lightning rod at this particular time to represent racism and became a very divisive issue here in Brunswick. All of a sudden, a statue that had stood on government land who was probably unnoticed by most people. I know I didn't notice it. This statue, who does not even have a name, became a hated symbol that was sprayed with graffiti of BLM, and formal procedures were initiated to have the statue removed from public land, removed to private land or a private museum was an option some had suggested. The community was pro or con, directly focused on removing the statue or letting it remain. Letters to the local newspapers, Zoom meetings of the commission and citizens were held, both pro and con, for and against, stating their position that the statue was racist or not racist. Those who wanted it to go say they didn't want taxpayers' money to pay for its maintenance. The other side say they were not racist. They wanted to memorialize their Confederate history. Why this history was not in a private land, on a private land, or in a private museum is a mystery to me. This back and forth threatened to turn this small city into a lightning rod for other groups to come into the city. So the mayor and city commissioners felt that they needed to address this hot button issue before control was lost and someone would try to forcibly remove the statue and damage it. The mood of the nation was becoming the mood of this city. So this local issue became number one to deal with. In this era of coronavirus pandemic, obtaining an interview from Brunswick, Georgia's Mayor Cornell Harvey was discouraged. The city's website provided some information that legal questions are still being weighed as to the legality of the removal of the statue. This research is currently being done by our city's attorney. Debates and discussions are still raging surrounding whether the statue stays or goes. Some have suggested the removal be a subject of a referendum by voters. Sentiments are running high, and the trickle-down effects from the George Floyd's murder to the murder of Ahmad Arbery have made the issue front and center. This may have influenced Brunswick voters to vote out the district attorney that I mentioned earlier, who refused to bring the initial charges against these men who killed Ahmad Arbery. She was voted out in 2020. In turn, this may have led the Georgia lawmakers to make it a crime in April last month of 2021 that if you remove a Confederate monument from public land, that it is a crime. I believe federalism plays a part in this local issue, and it's feeding off of what's going on nationally. The Confederate statue from public land in downtown Brunswick in the midst of heightened racial tensions around the nation and in the midst of a highly publicized killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the subsequent trial of the men charged with this crime to take place this year on a local, state, and federal, national level, the pros and cons across the nation are divided in their opinions of other monuments that are viewed as racist across the nation. If you can remember last year, other monuments were being pulled down across the nation. George Floyd's murder made this a national issue that cut across all government lines, local, state, and federal. This had an effect on the local issue of the statue here in Brunswick, that whereas the statue may not have even come to attention since it had been there over 100 years, but because of the national and what was going on in government nationally, attention was brought to this statue. It was a lightning rod, as I say. And also, the George Floyd bill, which passed the House, that deals with a lot of police reform, has stalled in the Senate. And they're refusing, a lot of them refusing to even vote for it. And so this is having a federalist state. It's affecting state, local, national levels, and it's drawing people to be on one side or the other. And here in Brunswick, it's no different. The lawmakers are reacting in Brunswick along with the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia has a larger Republican base, and they passed this law saying it will be a hate crime, which makes it that all citizens, whether you want the statue there or not, will have to pay taxes for this Confederate statue. And so it's just a back and forth, and it's affecting on all levels. In the midst of bitter debates and opinions and letters in the liberal paper, in the local paper, the people who support the statue to remain where it is argue that the monument has stood in that square for over 100 years with no major protest against it. They said it is not a symbol of racism, but a tribute to the Confederate soldiers who they believe fought valiantly to establish unsuccessfully a secession from the United States of America. They cite it as a type of Vietnam veteran memorial of the Civil War. My question is as to why this symbol of insurrection, this statue that they see as history, why is it on public land? Why not preserve your history on a private land or in a private museum? But it has gone without a rational explanation. No rational answer is given for why taxpayers who see the statue as a hate symbol of a failed insurrection much larger than January the 6th should have to support the maintenance of this statue and have to be subject to a hate crime if the statue is removed. Why should they be subject to even look at it if they go and visit this lovely park in the middle of downtown Brunswick? They say it's been there. Blacks and other people didn't say anything about it for over 100 years, but they forget that blacks were being persecuted at the time in 1902. We had a history in the South of persecution, segregation. And if any blacks or people who were for the blacks had said, "What are you doing putting up a statue of a Confederate hero on private land, on public land, they would have probably been killed." So this is an answer to that. Recommendations: I would recommend that policy changes should start with repealing this Georgia law that to me seems like just a knee-jerk reaction. It was just passed last year because they're saying that Confederate monuments should be preserved. Whether you agree with it or not, The law just added fuel to the fire, and a lot of people are seeing it as divisive. This law should be repealed. Confederate monuments and memorabilia, and I'm all, if a person wants to preserve them, they should be preserved in a private museum, private land. The Civil War was fought to preserve slavery in the South. It was the other side, the North, fought to end the slavery. Confederate statues, these monuments need to be moved to private lands and museums. But this seems to fall on deaf ears. If a healing is to come here in Brunswick, then removing this symbol of hatred that symbolized an era where other human beings were held as slaves would be a start. Germany has a law that no school or public building can be named after Hitler. Why should any German citizen want to name a school or a building after Hitler? Maybe Americans can ask the same question. Why do we as Americans want to keep these Confederate monuments on public land that remind us of one of the darkest periods in American history? And these are my references. And this is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, you can email me at my email, lindamczill@hotmail.com, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions or any of your comments. Thank you for attending my presentation.